Welcome. This is the Public Relations Review podcast, a program to discuss the many facets of public relations with seasoned professionals, educators, authors, and others. Now, here is your host, Peter Woolfolk.
Welcome to the Public Relations Review podcast and to our listeners across America and around the world. Many public relations professionals have some experience with crisis communications, perhaps with outcomes at either end of that scale. Dealing with a crisis for most of us is a part-time undertaking. My guest today specializes in crisis management and crisis prevention. Joining us today from Monrovia, California is Jonathan Bernstein, head of Bernstein Crisis Management. Now, Jonathan has massive crisis and issues management credentials since about 1982. His past experience includes 5 years of investigative and feature journalism, including working with the noted investigative reporter Jack Anderson. He's also spent time with Playboy magazine in the corporate communications part and with the Rudder Finn agency. He publishes Crisis Manager, a first-of-its-kind email newsletter for those who are crisis managers, whether they want to be or not, and it is read in 75 countries. He manages 2 industry-leading crisis blogs, Keeping the Wolves at Bay, Media Training, and A Manager's Guide to Crisis Management. A PR Week feature story, The Crunch Time Counselors identified Bernstein as one of the 22 people who should be on your speed dial in a crisis. And Business Week featured him in an article entitled Masters of Disaster. So having said all that, let me welcome Jonathan to the program. How are you?
I'm well, Peter. Thanks for having me on.
Well, good. Look, we've all seen just stories and articles and so forth about crisis communications and planning and that sort of thing, but very few people talk to us about the prevention side of that. So why don't you tell us what we need to do to begin to prevent these things from happening?
Well, first I'll say in my approximately 35 years of experience and those of the consultants who work with me, we have found that about 95% of the crises to which we've been called to respond have been completely preventable, as in completely preventable. So when you look at that, and that's certainly with the wisdom of hindsight, because the fire is already burning. But then when we do a post-crisis analysis, which is an important thing to do after a crisis has happened, we look for the root cause. And when we find, and invariably we find that if crisis prevention activities had taken place the way they should, and the way we'll talk about on your show in a moment, these crises could have been averted. And in other cases, even if the crisis couldn't have been averted, damage could have been greatly mitigated, much more than it actually was. So with that as kind of a foundation for this, the other is that I think anybody would agree with you or me that reputation is an organization's most valuable asset. But it doesn't get treated that way. Normally our most important assets are very well protected. And crisis management should be looked at as a critical form of asset protection. And it's not most of the time, because we still find that the vast majority of organizations out there are either underprepared or completely unprepared for breaking crisis, although that's changing. That's changed a lot in the last 10 years. So it used to be that 2/3 of the first incoming phone calls we got were for breaking crisis. Now about 2/3 of them are for crisis prevention work. And would you like me to outline the process for crisis prevention that we recommend to virtually anybody?
Why don't we do that? But one of the things I think that since you said most of them were preventable, could you sort of highlight some of the things that could have been done to prevent some of the crisis from taking place in the beginning?
Yes. One of the things is establishing that could have prevented quite a few crises is if the organizations involved had an internal whistleblowing system where people who saw trouble occurring, if they felt that they were afraid to go to their supervisor or didn't have a process for kicking things upstairs when they were a problem. They just didn't bother to proceed at that point. And so the issues were known at some low to mid level and not reported upstream. So, for example, there was a big developer in Hawaii some years ago, and they had a record rainfall there, what they call a 100-year rain, and there was runoff from the chemicals on the golf course at this development into a pristine bay off of Kona, Hawaii. And needless to say, the native Hawaiian population in particular were very upset about that. And we went there and we fought the fire from a reputation point of view. But afterwards, I was given permission to interview employees throughout the company there in Kona. And what I found was that some people in the grounds maintenance department knew that a particularly heavy rain, the drainage system would not be able to handle it, and there would be that runoff. And they mentioned it to their supervisor, who said, "Oh, we don't want to bother the people back at headquarters," which happened to be in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't. And if they had put in the right drainage systems, entirely preventable. In other cases, it's failure to plan for things like computer hacking or total loss of your primary server, wherever that happens to be located. It can even be something as simple as a question we ask people when we do what's called a vulnerability audit. We say, if you lost your primary place of business today, your headquarters building, your manufacturing site, whatever that is, would everybody here know where to report for work tomorrow and what they're supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is almost invariably no. Think of the amount of man hours, the amount of time, the amount of resources involved in actually getting a business restarted if there's a sudden loss like that.
Mm-hmm.
If that's planned for in advance, that process can take place very expeditiously. After 9/11, there were some financial services firms whose World Trade Center offices got virtually destroyed and all or most of their staff killed. Some of them had contingency backups for total loss. And they were back in business within a week and operating in another location they had everything all ready to go. They had backup rental arrangements already made or space sharing arrangements made with a friendly competitor.
Mm-hmm.
Others, months and months and months before they were able to get going again. What did that cost them in lost business? A huge amount, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some common examples for you.
Well, now let's then shift to your preventable itinerary, list of ways to prevent these sort of things from happening.
Right. Well, the first thing is to do essentially the crisis management equivalent of a full body scan, and what we call a vulnerability audit. And the very simplest form of vulnerability audit can be done by anybody in-house. You put your top people around the table and you say, what could go wrong this year with any part of our organization? And have we taken steps to make sure that doesn't happen?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have plans in place? Do we have backups in place? Backups is another area where there's often inadequate preparation because everybody thinks about backups for computer data. What about key personnel? And what about telephone systems if they crash? Or what about any system that can go down? And often that's not thought about. So you can have that kind of a brainstorming session for yourselves and answer your own questions about what needs to happen to mitigate any of the vulnerabilities found.
Mm-hmm.
A formal vulnerability audit, as done as we do it, is a process built on our multiple decades of experience because we reverse engineered crises for all of our careers. And so we know where the red flags are. So we ask questions like that question about, does everybody here know where to report for work today?
Mm-hmm.
Or in addition to having your data backed up, you also have a means of getting that data back into use after a total loss of a server,
mm-hmm.
because it takes more than just data to get a business going again. It needs the servers, it needs the software, it needs the personnel. There's a lot of other factors. So we lead our clients through a series of questions which invariably beget more questions. And over the course of a full day, sometimes longer, depending on the organization, we get a really good picture of where their strengths and vulnerabilities are. And what we prepare for our clients, and again, they could do this for themselves, is a prioritized list of vulnerabilities, either tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. Tier 1, I tell CEOs very frankly, take care of these now before your ass falls off. We're that blunt about it. And tier 2 is lesser priority. Tier 3 is even lower priority, but they're all important. And we identify why they're important, and we suggest the ways they can mitigate that. Sometimes maybe they need to hire a forensic expert. Maybe they need to hire an IT person to test their security and try to breach their security, whatever our recommendation is. And that all goes to the C-suite to make their decisions about what to do next. And typically a CEO response is to tell his team, okay, what's it going to take to get the tier 1 vulnerabilities taken care of soon? And they'll come back with a plan, and we work with them. And in some cases, we can help remedy the situation because, for example, if they've never had media training, we can provide media training. But a lot of times they can handle it all in-house once they have it all laid out. But I don't know, you may have seen this in organizations, Peter, but there's a phenomenon we call silos, where people just don't talk to each other in different departments of an organization.
Silos, absolutely.
And some organizations are particularly notorious for that. We do a lot of work with colleges, and the silos there, the faculty versus administration, students, all in different, alumni, they're all in different silos. And what the vulnerability audit process does is break down the walls of the silos.
Well, I certainly was involved in silos when I worked in the federal government in President Clinton's administration. The people who've been there for a while, what we found out was there was a lot of duplication going on there. We could have saved time, money, and energy, and we actually wound up resolving those issues. But nobody had thought to do anything about it in the past.
Exactly right. It's not a day-to-day responsibility for anybody. Normally, you don't have anybody in-house. You have a risk manager who's looking at the risk that they are insured for. But a lot of those are not, there's a whole broad category of crises that often are not covered by insurance that fall in the category of reputation crisis. If you're just being trashed entirely on the internet, your whole crisis is online, which is more and more true these days. Insurance may or may not cover that. Although I have to say, to the credit of the insurance industry, they are now offering products which will cover the cost of any crisis.
Well, I think that online crisis obviously is an ongoing problem that people need to face, and be willing to admit that you've got this problem, and certainly, as you said, know who to call to fix it if you don't have that capability in house. Right.
And we find, our goal is to also train our clients as much as they can be trained in the techniques we use. So some of them, sometimes they'll end up needing our help for a long time. Other times we train their people so well they almost never have to call us. So it's okay too.
One of the things that you mentioned, I think at the top, you said the internal whistleblowing program, because one of the problems that exists in some large organizations is that the people at the right there with the hands on and where they can see things going wrong sometimes don't feel comfortable reporting these problems up for whatever reason. How do you go about resolving that issue so that comfort level increases and it's accepted that you can report things, problems to higher management?
Well, firstly, it does start from the top down. The CEO has to make it very clear that he wants this to happen. He's encouraging people to participate. But also the system has to have at least two methods of reporting issues. One, for the record, where you don't mind being named, but you still feel a need to report a ticket upstairs. And the other, anonymous.
Okay.
And the anonymous method is the most important, but anonymous reporters have to be informed by the reporting system, whether that be a website or whatever is set up for these reports, has to be informed that they need to provide enough detail for someone to investigate without being able to talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
So it is on if a reporter wants to be anonymous, it's on them to provide enough detail. And then the company needs to decide whether to take any action or not. And obviously, if it's something blatant, a lot of employees will see that action has been taken. And in either case, if something, it's for the example of in Kona, in that incident, if that employee had felt comfortable reporting either for the record or anonymously, and in his case, I would have said he probably would have been anonymous, then the CEO back in Phoenix would have seen it much sooner and said, "This is not a risk worth taking.
Mm-hmm.
Let's fix the drainage system."
You know, one of the things that comes to mind is that this program, I think it's still on, Undercover Boss, I believe it is, where the boss,
Mm-hmm.
goes to
Mm-hmm.
franchise, whatever, and he talks to
Yep.
the line employees, and he finds out, well, as employees saying, well, this doesn't work, that doesn't work, or whatever. So, well, we have this program in place to handle this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, either the staff, they don't know about it, or that it has not
Mm-hmm.
been utilized. So it, for all practical
Yes.
purposes, it's useless. So those kind
Yes.
of issues have to be fixed as well.
Yes, training has to go along with it. It's one thing to establish new policies and procedures, but they are meaningless, as you say, without training to accompany them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions we asked during a vulnerability audit, we asked about their existing policies on media spokesperson, who's the media spokesperson, what are their policies for privacy, et cetera. And, and then the other question is there training to go along with these policies?
Mm-hmm.
And any policy that's critical to crisis prevention or crisis response, you've got to have training to go along with it. And that isn't often thought of. The HR department needs to be very involved often in setting up and making sure the training or refresher training in these topics take place, even though they're not directly related to improving their ability to provide a particular good or service. They are critical to protecting their most important asset.
I think the other thing that you may have mentioned that is because of the importance of preventing these, well, you might not be able to prevent them all, but whatever the policies are in place, that should originate from the CEO, whoever the head of the organization is, to let people know that we are taking it seriously. So, here it is, and we expect you to follow these guidelines, and here are some things that we can do to minimize any damage to us. But that needs to really come from the top all the time.
It does. And I have seen sometimes when there's been a change of CEO in an organization, and the first CEO was a champion of this process, and the second didn't care that much. And I've seen all of a sudden they're slacking off on the training, and all of a sudden their crisis plans are way outdated, and there's been personnel turnover, and none of the personnel have been trained. And so there always needs to be a champion. Hopefully it gets actually built into corporate culture. And I've got a number of longtime clients that I can say best practices in crisis management are now best practices at those organizations.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't start that way. Most of them started with bad crises that scared them enough that they wanted to get it done right from that point on.
Well, I know we've talked about the business side of it, but let me just get your take. I think we've all seen that interview that Prince Andrew had, and he's being widely criticized about that. How would you have guided him in preparing for or addressing that interview?
I would have advised him never to do the interview. Simple. That was a lose-lose proposition, and it was, I understand from what I've read, just about the same things you've read, that he was advised not to do it,
mm-hmm.
and felt that he could handle it.
I've heard that before.
I've heard that before,
right?
From clients. Oh, I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does point out is the dramatic difference between a routine media interview and a crisis-related media interview.
Absolutely.
The first is to build and promote whatever it is that you build and promote. And in this case, I would assume the reputation of the monarchy. That's the asset that he holds closest to him. But in a crisis, when there's a crisis involved, it's to preserve and protect. And it's a different mindset. It's more of a police mindset, frankly. And Royals are not used to that. Particularly, he's been getting away with, despite the Randy Andy nicknames and all of that, for the most part, he's flown below the radar before Jeffrey Epstein. But the moment he was connected with him so firmly with pictures and words, the best thing he could have possibly done was actually take himself off the public table and just go do what I call doing a Bill Clinton. Just go off camera for a while, go off and do a lot of good on the side, let people forget about your transgression some, and then come back later as the head of a charity and just be remembered for being the head of a charity, and people forget about it over time. But there is no way this close to the Jeffrey Epstein news that the Prince should have ever done an interview with any reporter, because the questions he was asked were not particularly hard, but they were very logical to be asked.
Well, it was reported that someone on his PR team, or the head of the PR team, resigned once he decided he was going to push forward on it, because they too had suggested that he not do the interview.
Yes.
But as you said,
and I would have resigned. I would have resigned the account, even if it was a paid account by the British royal family, for the same reason.
I've seen it, that people think they can handle it. They get in, the water gets too deep, they start thrashing, and you've got to run in and try to bail them out of it.
Yeah, and to continue that analogy, since I was a lifeguard in my youth, a drowning swimmer tends to take people down with them if you're not careful when you approach them.
Well, Jonathan, this has been very, very enlightening. Do you have anything that you believe that all of our listeners should know in terms of their not only crisis preparation but also crisis prevention?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, encourage clients. I have seen a trend to some extent trying to go to what I call generic crisis planning, and there are some very good pre-formatted plans out there, published in books, published on PRSA sites periodically, but there's an old expression from the early days of computer use: garbage in, garbage out. Having a form doesn't mean you know how to fill it out. Right. And there is no single form that fits any organization. You need to be able to adapt it. No two of our plans are the same. No two of our vulnerability audits are the same. Yes, we start with a form or format, but it's there. And I've seen this. People wanted to take a shortcut, thinking they could just fill in the blanks and you see this question probably too on my PRSA on the website where we originally made our connection. Is people say, does anybody have a fill in the blank plan I can use? And then they're going to turn around and bill a client for that? I don't think so. If that plan is not based on a vulnerability audit, then that plan is not accurate. It does not handle the client's needs fully. You can't write an accurate either operational response plan or communications response without really doing at least your own at-home vulnerability audit and knowing where the weak links are. If you don't know that you have a website that's going to crash when it reaches, say, 100,000 users in a day, which if you're a retailer and you have a crisis, you would easily exceed, then there's a vulnerability you could have prevented if you'd bothered to ask the question. Instead, what happens when a website crashes at a major retailer? All their customers get really upset. And if it's preventable, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars would an Amazon or anybody else lose in 10 minutes of time being down? And yet someone in the organization may actually know how to prevent that if you ask the right question.
Well, once again, let me say thank you to Jonathan Bernstein, head of Bernstein Crisis Management, for providing these exceptionally insightful ideas as to how to go about preventing you having a crisis in your particular organization. And thank you again for listening. And join us again for the next edition of the Public Relations Review.
This podcast is produced by Communication Strategies. an award-winning public relations and public affairs firm headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us.